Hello and welcome to the Media Roundtable Special Edition, where we dive into the secrets of the craft and provide our perspective on industry topics in service of marketers responsible for the success of their audio program, the Chief Audio Officer. I am your host, Giles Martin, EVP of Strategy and Insights at Oxford Road. I'm glad to be joined by Pete Birsinger, CEO and founder of Podscribe. Welcome, Pete.
Thank you, Giles. I'm honored to be here.
Well, it's great to have you here, Pete. And we're going to be diving today into what we're calling Rethinking YouTube Podcasts. And this is some work that Pete and I and our teams have worked on over the course of this year and actually presented back in August at, was it Podcast Movement Evolutions?
Yeah, Podcast Movement in Dallas.
Podcast Movement in Dallas, that's right. So we presented this there originally, and we've been putting some fine-tuning to it over the past few months, and we're releasing a white paper about this as well, because it's, again, an industry-first study, we believe, that's really focused on the difference in performance between sort of native RSS, sort of historical audio podcasting impressions, if we can call them that, and YouTube podcast impressions. We can call them that, obviously, respectively, their downloads and views. But I think many of you will be aware that in the industry historically, there hasn't really been a very good way to compare the effectiveness of those YouTube impressions and the audio-only impressions. And what this work does is do that for the very, very first time. It actually builds on some work that I presented with another partner of ours, Midge, at the CAO Summit in July, where we worked with some passive monitoring passive monitoring panel to begin understanding, or to see if we could, evaluate the response rates coming from exposure to YouTube ads for the very first time. And we were able to get some signal from YouTube at that time, but we were not able to take that crucial next step, which is to compare the YouTube impressions effectiveness with the traditional audio impressions effectiveness. And, what the industry does today, well, Pete, you're probably best positioned to speak about that. So why don't you tell us what people are doing for now?
All right. Well, first off, I think this topic is probably the most important topic in podcast measurement. I think if you talk to advertisers who are buying podcasts right now, the top thing they want in measurement, the biggest void, the biggest unlocker of revenue, is some way to measure the host-read embedded ads on YouTube. And I think just to clarify, it may be obvious to a lot of listeners, but when we talk about measuring the YouTube ads here, we're not talking about the YouTube ads where YouTube stops the video.
Thank you.
I think it's probably obvious to most listeners, but we're talking about those host-read ads where the host will read an ad as part of their actual content and bake it in to their content. That is where there is a massive measurement void right now. And the reason it's a problem is because YouTube views there's a ton of consumption there. In our latest PPB, we show advertisers who are buying episodic buys. 3 out of 4 of them now actually have YouTube views. And of campaigns that have both podcast downloads and YouTube views, typically YouTube view counts are 60% of the total counts. Mm. So it's not a minor matter. It's a huge portion of consumption. So
yeah,
just to set the stage without dodging your question too much.
No, thank you. Thank you for doing that. And sorry, if I can just add one thing before you finally get to answering the question. No, we had at the CAO Summit, we had a survey go out to the attendees, and it was a really, really marked thing that came back in their responses. I think 50% of them said they lacked confidence in measurement on podcasts, specifically alluding to YouTube. And we asked another question about, how much would marketers be willing and able to scale budgets if they could have measurement on YouTube that was comparable to what they had in podcasts, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but for example, I think around 25% think that they would probably be able to double their podcast budget. So, there's a lot of potential here, a lot of scale, which, just to reinforce your point about this being such an important topic in the industry.
Totally. And that money would go back to creators too, because in effect, when the measurement is so difficult, it limits the brands who can advertise there. It limits how much they can advertise and how much they can spend. So it's a bottleneck for the whole ecosystem. And even though it seems to be an advertiser matter, this measurement thing, it does impact creators because it devalues their inventory if it can't properly be measured.
Yep.
So to get at last to your question,
I'm sorry
of what
about
is the
dig. That was totally
what is
unnecessary.
The state of the art? Probably in most advertisers now that we work with use promo codes, vanity URLs, post-purchase surveys, and some use our modeling, where we model the performance of of a baked-in ad on YouTube from the performance of that same ad on that same episode, but in audio. So it's not exactly the most sophisticated. I think there's actually a lot that goes into it under the scenes, and it does give a baseline estimate. And we can talk about some updates that I think we can make to it that are coming soon. But yeah, promo codes, vanity URLs, post-purchase surveys are the ways people do it without us, and then with us, we can help model it. So
is it accurate to say that when you do that modeling, essentially you are assuming that the video impressions work with the same strength as the audio impressions?
Yes, exactly. Okay. Which is a big assumption that this work here has tested for the first time ever. And so, yeah, for just as an example, say we have a podcast that has 100 downloads. If we see one conversion come from that, so a conversion rate of 1%, then if we see that same ad occur on the same YouTube episode, and the YouTube episode has 100 views, we'll say, okay, well, a 1% conversion rate on audio, take a 1% conversion rate also on video. So then one conversion for each. So right now it does assume they both are roughly equal. We have a slider where you can adjust it, but I think the reason we did that at first was we honestly had no idea which was more, and it seemed, instead of making an arbitrary guess in one direction or another, make them equal.
Yes.
I think that's why it's so important. But yeah.
Well, I think in the absence of any other data, I think it's the most reasonable assumption you can make, probably. So I think a lot of our clients, at least, were, I think, quite comfortable with that as an assumption, at least getting started. And I think, perhaps a year or two ago, there was a fewer proportion of impressions on YouTube. So it may not have been such a big assumption, or an assumption with such big implications. But now, to your point, if it's 40% or 60% of the impressions that are coming in on YouTube, that assumption becomes increasingly important in terms of its implications for the industry and for marketers' confidence on what they're actually able to get accuracy on.
Totally. And I think that the survey results you mentioned on the importance of this underscores how the current methods leave something to be desired for.
Yeah.
Our not only our modeling, but promo codes and surveys. I think they can give some signal, but those results you quoted, I don't think people would be saying we would spend so much more, and so many people would be saying that if the current tools were fully adequate.
Yeah. So that one-to-one assumption, I think, is interesting. I think it's a reasonable starting place for the industry. Like I say, logical in the absence of any other data, but I think it obviously is an assumption with quite a lot of implications, and obviously we know they're quite different environments in terms of media experience, media exposure. So anyway, we're going to talk more about that once we've looked at some of the results that we're going to present today, which I think might be, somewhat surprising or counterintuitive for some people. So we'll present the results, then we can talk more about the sort of media experience later on. But I'll just get started giving a brief overview of the methodology, and feel free to jump in at any point if there's anything to clarify, etc. But essentially, we're looking at data sets from many clients from both Podscribe and Oxford Road. In the data sets overall, there are over 100 clients in total and over 1,000 different campaigns that have been run. So it's a nice big data set that we're pulling from. And we actually split it into two separate groups. We had one data set that was focused on advertisers that used promo codes to measure response on YouTube. And the second data set was advertisers that had used "How did you hear about us?" question or survey on their checkout experience to measure the response of podcasts and YouTube. And it's important, I think, and we'll, I'm sure, stress this again later on, but when we're talking about the impact here of audio versus video, we have only looked at it with respect to their ability, these impressions' ability to drive promo code usage or survey usage, and so the generalizability of that to sort of general response is, I think, and also an important topic that we'll get to probably later on. But for each of those two data sets, we had impressions that had been delivered on audio and impressions that had been delivered on YouTube. And so we were able to sort of calculate the total number of impressions by just adding up the YouTube and the audio impressions, and then look at response rates. So that's the number of promo codes delivered divided by the number of impressions, or promo codes used, or the number of survey responses, saying podcast, divided by the number of impressions, total number of impressions. So those were the main metrics that we looked at. Anything to add there, Pete?
Just to rehash, we looked at it with two independent data sets, both promo codes and surveys. So two totally separate data sets that are unrelated, to try to see, are YouTube views better? Do they work harder for the advertiser, as hard or less hard? So two independent sets. And then, within the analysis too, I think there was, Giles did a lot of the data side, so he was behind much of this, but I believe there was one analysis where we compared the performance of pure audio buys to buys that were simulcast, that had both audio and video. And that was pretty telling. I'll let Giles jump in there if he wants. But so there was that, and then it was also the performance of simulcast buys depending on how much audio or video they were. So maybe a YouTube, a simulcast campaign was 10% YouTube views, and then another campaign was 90% YouTube views. So how did those differ by conversion rates? The greater 8% of the consumption was on YouTube for views. So
and I think that's a helpful segue, because when we looked at this, essentially, we're looking for relationships between the amount of audio impressions or the amount of video impressions or the amount of simulcast impressions with promo code volume or survey volume. And there are lots of different ways to cut that, and lots of different ways to look at outliers and things like that. And a slightly more advanced way of doing that, still simple, but is to use regression analysis. And so we did all these different ways of looking at the data, but something we realized quite early on was, first, two key things. And one of them, I think, is what Pete was just saying. So that idea of, here's a campaign that was, say, 30% audio and 70% YouTube. Splitting the data up into deciles in that way made it actually a much more simple way of sort of seeing clear patterns in the data. So that was something that we did in both of our analyses, both on the surveys and on the promo codes, is split the impressions in the way Pete was describing, so we could see whether there was clear movement or trend in the data as the impressions, as the share of impressions on YouTube, say, increased. Did we see response rates increase or decrease? So that was one of the key things we did. And then the second really important thing is we ended up breaking down the data set and looking at individual advertisers, and looking at advertisers individually. And I think that's really important to call out because, and, Pete, you would push for this a lot, and thank you for doing so, because you're absolutely right to. Every advertiser obviously is so different, not just in terms of, what market are they operating? Are they B2B? Are they B2C? What kind of product are they selling? But also how expensive is the product? If you're selling a day-to-day type of product, it's probably, $5 or $10 or $20. Whereas if you're selling an exercise bike with a, cutting edge touchscreen, interface, it might be thousands of dollars. And so when you're looking at response rates, obviously there'd be enormous variety in response rates just on the basis of the advertiser, and also what type of offer they have and what type of incentives they have, and those types of things. So we ended up not just cutting the impressions on the media side into deciles, but also isolating all of the advertiser campaigns individually and looking for trends across all of those advertisers, see if there was consistency there.
Right. One other point too, I think worth mentioning that people might be thinking about is, well, how did we ensure that the ad was the same on audio in video?
Oh yeah.
Because I think that's an important point. So we did take steps to ensure generally that the ads that we are comparing on audio were the exact same ones airing on video. The one thing we didn't distinguish that I think would be helpful in a future study is whether the video ads whether they had product placement, whether they were the video meaningfully added to it in any way. We just really checked that the transcripts were more or less matched, and that the length was the same, that there were the same number of ads on either side. So I think there's more that could be done there, but generally we did ensure that the same ad was running on audio in video too. So
yes, thank you. Important point. Yeah.
Tell me if you've ever heard of any of these companies: Shopify, DraftKings, Oracle, Warby Parker, Mint Mobile, Quince. I am proud to say that half of the top 10 advertisers in podcasting choose to work with Oxford Road. We are now the world's largest podcast advertising agency, and we do so much more than that. YouTube, radio, streaming. We are on 6 continents working internationally. Reach out to us. We'll tell you about Woven, which is probably the world's largest database of show information that's relevant for brands. Orbit, which is $1.6 billion of aggregated performance data used to de-risk every single campaign. Audiolytics, where we can actually measure ad copy and optimize it to maximize performance. We got a lot going on over here. That's why you can read about us in the Wall Street Journal or the Hollywood Reporter or USA Today or Business Insider. But whatever you need, we try to bring thought leadership that matters to you. Sign up for our newsletter that is called The Influencer. When you go to oxfordroad.com, you can always learn more at the Media Roundtable podcast. We got a lot of interesting content. If you just want to learn about this business, and if you don't care, but you just need somebody to make sure that you're getting outcomes that only we can deliver, go to oxfordroad.com and learn more. And make sure you mention the Media Roundtable, because attribution. That's oxfordroad.com.
Great. Well, and in terms of what we saw, so once we looked at these advertisers, we looked at their distribution of impressions split into deciles with heavier audio skew on the left and then heavy YouTube skew on the right. So going from 100% audio on the left, no podcast, down to 90% audio, 10% YouTube, 80% audio, 20% YouTube, going all the way down to 100% YouTube at the other extreme. And we generally saw, we ended up having, I think, 22 or 23 advertisers in that final data set, where we sort of felt we had sufficient, volume to look at those sort of deciles in a way
the promo code data set.
This is promo codes. Yes, sorry, promo codes. And I mean, I don't know if this is necessarily the best way to sort of represent the results, but we ended up charting these 22 or 23 advertisers. I think it was 23 advertisers, all together, so we could look at all of these charts on a single screen. And 18 of those 23 had a downward trend line of, either a mild one or a more extreme one, showing that as the percentage of YouTube impressions increased, the amount of promo code response, relative to the number of impressions, the response rate or the efficiency in terms of driving promo codes tended to decrease. And, 18 out of 23 was a pretty significant. And, we encourage you to download the white paper and take a look at these charts for yourself. And I will give a great call to action at the end of the show, driving you all to the website to download it. But please take a look at the white paper, see the charts for yourself. It's quite clear when you see across all of these advertisers that there is a pretty significant trend there, pretty significant pattern. And even for the other 5 advertisers, I think my recollection of it is, with only 11 deciles there, I know that's a bit of a contradiction, but there were 11. Even just one big outlying data point could sort of skew the line, where it otherwise might have gone down, it might go up. And I think there were a few cases where there were sort of situations like that. And so a few borderline ones, there were probably only 1 or 2 where the trend seemed to go up. And even in those cases, I think it was quite mild. So it certainly felt like there was a good amount of convergence in that data.
It did. It seemed pretty mind-boggling, I think, when we first looked at it, because this did seem not like at least what I had expected at first, that YouTube views seemingly were less effective at driving promo code redemptions. It was totally not the conclusion that we were thinking. And just to reiterate, both campaigns that were pure audio, and we analyzed those relative to simulcast ones that were mixed audio and video, the pure audio ones had significantly better response rates for promo codes. So that's not quite as granular as the decile analysis Giles showed, but even just pure audio campaigns versus pure or YouTube and podcast campaigns, the audio ones really stood out. There's a great visual that's in the white paper that shows that. And then it was clear too, both when looking at all the advertisers individually and even when grouping them together in deciles, that the conversion rate or the promo code redemption rate got worse the more YouTube that was added in. And I was definitely surprised. I would say before the study, for the longest time, I truthfully thought video views would be better. I thought because, a view means at least they watched some of it. A download, you don't necessarily know. There could be product placements. They're on their computer. Maybe they can buy right there. So I was surprised. And I think neither of us, would you say, Giles, felt totally confident in the promo code analysis without getting another data set to see what it thought or what it said.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that was one of the reasons, again, we had to do that advertiser breakdown so we could see this pattern repeated across, many different advertisers and see, consistency in that trend. But yes, we actually saw, spoiler alert, very similar types of patterns with the survey data set as we did with the promo codes data set. And so, that did give us extra confidence when looking at this data, which we did. We treated these results, as Pete's saying, with some degree of caution, because I'm not sure I had a super strong hypothesis, but I guess I was probably leaning towards YouTube somewhat, just sort of out of some type of inherent bias or how much time I spend there.
Right. It sort of seemed like it, although a number of people we asked didn't totally. They thought otherwise. Maybe we were the outliers.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that, and I'm glad you mentioned it. I mean, I don't know if there's anything more that you can say, like how many people perhaps you spoke to. I know you've sort of taken some unofficial temperature from the industry about, what they might have expected prior to this.
Well, that is an interesting thing, I think, to mention here. So when we were putting out these or starting to write up these results, we had the promo code results showing YouTube views did worse for advertisers. Then, spoiler, the survey results showed the same thing. So we were thinking, okay, well, is it something really weird about our data? Because we didn't even necessarily think, we thought it would be the opposite, to be honest. So then I started asking a couple people at various organizations in the industry and buyers and sellers. And to a degree, most of them who were really in the weeds did actually say, yeah, that makes total sense. We price, simulcast views, our YouTube views in simulcast a little less than podcast. We've been doing that for years, or things like that. I would hear, and I'd be like, huh, interesting. So that, not that it's a complete data point in the story, but anecdotally, when we were asking around, there did seem to be a number of head nods in the industry, just so we could see, are we about to put out a conclusion that is totally unheard of and crazy, which maybe we would regardless if the data seemed to show it, but it seemed anecdotally a lot of people had sort of seen that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it was interesting hearing some of that from you, and but also interesting hearing from the people who expect YouTube to be stronger. And again, I mean, this is the first time that to my knowledge, at least, anyone's published anything like this comparison in the industry at all. So it's great to put something out there to give people something to react to and sort of start the work on this.
Especially as podcasting becomes more fragmented and we have, for at least the time being, no unifying download or impression or play metric, it is super important to know what is the relative value of each of these different metrics that we're receiving, because surely they're not equal. It's just a matter of, though, how can we dig in and analyze what's the the relative worth.
Mm-hmm. So I think we can get into the discussion quite quickly here. I mean, in terms of the actual results that we found, so on the promo code side, our model ended up estimating that YouTube impressions are about 25% less effective than the corresponding audio impressions, in the same shows, same episodes, same campaigns. Again, that's based on promo code response specifically. And for the survey data set, the second data set, we actually ended up having a smaller data set there because promo code use is more widespread than survey results. And in terms of sort of having enough sample in there for those advertisers, we ended up using 7 in the data set for the decile analysis, looking at the survey results. 6 out of those 7 advertisers, similarly to what we saw with promo codes, showed a sort of clear downward trend as we go to the right, a downward trend in the number of survey responses indicating a podcast as we went to a sort of higher percentage of YouTube impressions, and a similar type of model there estimated that YouTube impressions were 18% less effective than pure audio impressions at driving survey responses. So as Pete alluded to earlier, as we touched on, it was important and valuable for us to have, 2 different data sets here, 2 different response mechanics that we could look at to see, did we see consistency in the results? I think one of the things we've learned over many years of working in attribution is, there's not most of the time, at least, one single magic right answer, and we're often looking for convergence in data, that is pointing in the same direction, telling a similar type of story. And we definitely saw that both within each of these analyses and then across both of them as well. So again, even if we did have some hesitations about the implication of these results and sort of a few raised eyebrows here and there internally, we've seen some convergence here, and that's why we're publishing these results, because I don't think we would, publish something like this if we didn't see some degree of convergence in this data. So, I mean, we can get into now some of the thoughts and hypotheses on what might be going on here. But before we do, Pete, you might want to jump in with any final points.
Well, to recap, when you say the YouTube views are 25% worse based on the promo code analysis and 18 based on the survey results, just to try to put that in an example, and you can let me know if my numbers might be off. But say for example, you're as a listener, you're an advertiser, and you have 1,000 podcast downloads and 1,000 YouTube views. If the 1,000 podcast downloads drive 10, call it 10 conversions, then you could reasonably expect that same number of YouTube views, 1,000, to drive 7 or 8 conversions. So so from the other side of it, it's even more drastic if you say, well, how much more efficient are podcast downloads than YouTube views? Maybe it's closer to 30 something percent if you sort of flip it. But yeah, so it makes sense. But yeah, the reactions. What were you? How do you rationalize what's happening here?
Well, I think there's a few things to say, and I think the first thing to acknowledge again is this point about generalizability, right? So, does the fact that we're seeing lower promo code use per impression mean that there is lower response per impression, however we define that? Like, typically you work in a pixel-based environment where there is, promo code use may or may not be in play, and typically you're looking at response and evaluating response in a very different way. You're looking at exposure to an ad and then some type of subsequent activity on a website. So can we generalize to all response from this data? I think that, perhaps similarly to how you started with the assumption of, well, we'll treat audio and video impressions as the same for now in the absence of better data. Perhaps in the absence of better data, we can say, well, yeah, we can generalize this for now. I think, one of the key things coming out of this, which I know we'll touch on before the end, but is, this is just the first piece of work that's been done on this. Like, we'd love to see more studies. We'd love to see refinements of this work, and perhaps the story may change over time. But, whether or not people respond with a promo code or a survey is not the whole story about advertising effectiveness. I think it is fair to say that.
It's a good reminder.
But, one of the things that I thought was really interesting when we were at Podcast Movement in Dallas, somebody came up after the presentation and made this interesting point about international, which I wanted to hand over to you to talk about if you're happy to.
Yes, it was Thomas and Kate at QCode. Actually, they pointed out to me after our presentation, they said, well, some key things that could be responsible for this or that could explain this that deserve someone to look, that someone should look into more are, one, YouTube views are often much more international than podcast downloads. And we do see that too when we analyze the country location of YouTube subscribers. We do see that most of the top shows have a much bigger percent of their consumption outside the US than podcast downloads for whatever reason that may be.
And the clients in our data set are only looking at US responses?
Primarily. Some of them may be, some of the web-based ones may be, I think do some do allow international customers, but I think most their target customer is really the US. And I think and even for ones where their target customers can be, or they can have customers globally, I think the most affluent listeners are in the US. And so even if you can have somebody purchase somewhere else in the globe, the US ones might respond the best because in many cases they have the most money. So that is a super important factor. And I think we're working on a follow-up analysis for that. We are looking to improve our YouTube modeling to make it, really smart YouTube modeling where it does take into effect the country breakout of YouTube channels. I think that is a super important point and a great one to look into more.
Yeah, and then there was this other sort of just general, it's a hypothesis, I guess, not something that sort of can be hard proved or anything, but just the difference in the user experience and the sort of media environment that we alluded to on the start of the call. And there is something that's sort of quite unique about podcasts, especially if you think back over, I've been in the industry since 2018, and certainly when I started, advertisers, the pixels were just coming into the market, like shortly after I started. And so advertisers to that point, they were using promo codes and vanity URLs and surveys exclusively to measure podcast performance. And so, a lot of the podcast listening audience, at least obviously there's been a lot of growth and a lot of new listeners coming in, particularly in older and young and oldest sort of demographics. But there's still a lot of listeners that have been in podcasting for a long time already. And they've had many, many years of hearing their hosts talk about using a promo code and support the show by, going to a website and using a specific vanity URL. And they want to support the show. And so they do use the vanity or they do use the promo code. And I think that there's some extent to which, in the podcast environment, your listeners are, more conditioned really to be using promo codes. Whereas in YouTube, it's a bit more of a different experience. And you're not so used to that in that YouTube environment. And there are related points there. I mean, please jump in at any point. But, similarly, in the YouTube environment, I feel there's, a lot more competition for your attention. So typically in podcasting, and there's a lot of research that shows, many people are multitasking when they're listening to a podcast, and maybe they're cooking or walking the dog or in the gym or something like that. But, typically you have that audio, headphones in, it's in your brain, and your attention is on, that and whatever else you're doing, but it's basically absorbed, in those two things. And yet when you're on YouTube, you've got one video. Your podcast, by the way, may have been recommended to you by the YouTube algorithm. So that's another big point. Whereas, in audio, much of that content is being fed to you via subscription, which you've actively chosen. Whereas in YouTube, there could be more sort of random exposure. So that's another point there. But also, yes, it may be more random, but also, you've got a lot of other things competing for your attention on that screen, many other thumbnails, et cetera, et cetera. So I think my theory, and this is somewhat supported, sorry, I'm going to give you a word in just a second, but there was a chart that I was looking at the other day showing retention by minute across Spotify, Apple, and YouTube, and the retention on YouTube, and it was just one show and just one episode. So I don't want to, draw big conclusions from this, but I think it could be illustrative of a general point. Was on YouTube, the audience had dropped by, I think, over 50% within the first, 2 or 3 minutes, whereas when the audio environments, it was still at sort of the 80% plus level at that time. So those are some of my thoughts on it, Pete. Sorry to go on a bit, but over to you.
Yeah, I think what you're saying that I most agree with is the opt-in, lean-in nature of podcasting relative to that of YouTube. With YouTube, all the time I go on there, dozens of new videos, people I've never heard of, seems relevant. Maybe I'll click one and that pop back out. And I think more of that discovery and more of that consumption based on what's in your feed probably leads to that higher drop off rate in YouTube consumption that you're mentioning there, Giles. So yeah, I mean, if you imagine they're listening to a podcast, for better or worse, I mean, it's hard to listen to a podcast. You gotta, go to Apple Podcasts, which not that many people know how to use, and maybe you're on Spotify, but then you got to search it and then you got to play it. You really have to have intent to listen to a podcast. So if you're going through those steps and you're not just randomly clicking something on YouTube, you really want to be there. You want to be listening to that host. You've heard something about them. You like them. You trust them, which is a good thing for advertisers, surely. And then couple that with maybe more of an international breakdown of YouTube views. I think those are two powerful explanations. I think there is a third. I don't know. Do you think should we get into maybe the definition of plays versus downloads?
Yeah, let's get into it. And then, I mean, gosh, the time's flown by. We've had such fun with this conversation. So yes, please touch on it. I think it's a good point. And then we can start wrapping up.
Well, one thing that people don't think much about, certainly I never did much, is how do you count a play versus a download? And so in theory, I believe a play, maybe this won't be quite right, but I believe a play is...
Or a view.
Or sorry, a view.
Yeah.
A view on YouTube is 30 seconds of consumption, and I believe you can do it a number of times per day for the same episode. I think if it's like within the same session, it might not count it multiple times, but maybe if you come back later, it's sort of ambiguous how it can be counted, to be totally honest. And a download is counted when your phone or device downloads at least 1 minute of content for whatever episode you're listening to. So they're very different counting mechanisms. And on the surface, it may seem that, a play is, that's, for the same amount of consumption, a play count would be lower, because like a download, they could be downloaded and then you never even listen, which one might think. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think it is possible that, because maybe you can have a play a number of times per day and we don't have exact insights into the YouTube algorithm, it is possible if I stop this Rogan episode now, come back later today, or tomorrow and play it again, that's going to be like 4 plays. But a download, though, I downloaded it once to my phone today. Maybe I listened to half the Rogan episode today, half tomorrow. It's still 1. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that that downloads are, more inflated. I think there's a very good chance it could be the opposite. In fact, that downloads are more conservative than plays. I don't think we can know for sure, or maybe we'll ever know for sure without the third party looking at the YouTube consumption, but it's worth keeping in mind, I think.
Really interesting. So you're saying that really there's, no apples to apples unit of exposure, and therefore, are we even really comparing the same things? And actually, could there be a pretty significant sort of delta in terms of what these metrics really represent?
Right. And I think in the Spotify scenario, they've recently released their play metric, which is a consumption-based metric, they believe, similar to YouTube views. They still have their streams metric, and you can, if you're a creator, see your podcast downloads on Spotify. And I think in a lot of cases, if you look, what you'll notice is that the play counts are actually higher than the streams or download counts, which is very counterintuitive. You would think the plays would be less. So that's just one example, but I think it just to illustrate, we don't really know much about a view or how it's counted, and it very well could be, the counts could be inflated relative to downloads.
Yeah. If only there was some industry initiative trying to solve this. Anyway, so before we move into some recommendations for brands and people on the sales side as well, just a couple of, we already mentioned these qualifiers, but the international piece I think would be a great next step, which I think you said you're already working on. But any way that can be tackled would be really helpful, I think, because if we could eliminate that element from the analysis, and focus on other variables, that would help to, confirm or deny what we found here. And someone else made a good point, and perhaps you touched on this already. I think you did, but we're really treating all simulcast ads as the same with this analysis. There's no distinction between ones that are basically just an audio ad with a logo, thrown over the top for 30 seconds versus one that is, got a real, strong visual component where perhaps the host is leaning in, or perhaps one further where the host is maybe doing a demo or actually showing the product or doing some type of unboxing. Like, these are all very different sort of ad exposure media experiences. And for now, again, like, we're treating everything as one. So these are some ideas for how we could take this, this exploration further. And again, this is just the start.
Also, where the ad is, where the ad is in the episode too. That's I think one other important fact. Maybe the podcast ad is early on. Maybe the YouTube ad was put right at the end, where 90% of listeners are not making it to.
Yep. Well, and that was one of the recommendations that I had both for for the buy side and the sell side. Like, if you're a buyer, the issue of, if we buy that hypothesis, right, of the drop off being much quicker on YouTube, then if you're a buyer, the value of the insertion varies enormously by the placement. which is something that may not get significantly, incorporated into the negotiation right now, but could be that the price is, 2 or 3 times, let's say, or the value is 2 or 3 times, higher for a pre-roll, for example, than it might be for a mid-roll. And so these types of things are really important to start addressing in negotiation and really looking at where your ads are running and are you get a fair and even rotation of ads, both in pre-rolls and in mid-rolls, and, not getting skewed perhaps towards parts of the show that are not getting so much ad exposure. That's one obvious area for, the market to be looking at.
Super important. Yeah.
I think briefly some other thoughts. This is an obvious point, but like treating audio and video ads differently. For example, Podscribe already alluded to the fact that Pete said they have a one-to-one sort of YouTube versus audio. That's where they start with their modeling, but actually now there's a slider in their platform where you can now adjust down the assumptions about how hard the video is working. So I think it's important to treat audio and visual impressions differently moving forward, whether you're looking at analysis or sales or anything else. I think if you're using surveys, I think it's really important to try and distinguish between the audio and video elements of a podcast. I think it's possible in a survey if you get it set up right and you're really clear about how you ask those questions. And that could be a really valuable source of data for us and the industry as we move forward, as more brands start to really pick apart the audio and the video signals there. We talked about the importance of tracking internationally and picking that apart. And I think, if video is an important part of the buy, if you're on the sales side, or if you're, in media strategy, anything else, can we do more now? Video is becoming, a real sort of endemic part of the ecosystem to leverage video strengths when we are there, and sometimes when we have clients come to us and perhaps they're in, say, fashion or something like a category that's a really visual category, often they have hesitations about, can I get this to work in, an audio-only environment? And I think often even very visual brands can. But if you are a visual brand and you're running in YouTube, can you really take advantage of that YouTube environment, that visual environment? And again, there may be pricing adjustments on both sides, related to that. But, it's clear that these different environments do seem to work in different ways. And I think, the market needs to adjust their approaches in these ways to reflect that.
One piece of context, I know we're just about at time to,
please.
I think put out there is this work is great and all. I think it's totally the first of its kind. I think it sheds light, a very interesting and useful light on how downloads compare to views. But it is all worth keeping in mind. This is not really our first choice. This is only because we cannot actually pixel YouTube. So the first, I think, biggest aim is thinking, how can we actually measure YouTube views like we can podcast downloads? What we're trying to do here is only because we can't. That's the only reason.
Thank you. Good point.
It's so important. So I think we are working on it. I think there's actually a really good shot at YouTube views being measurable in the next year. If you're a creator and looking to get into YouTube dynamic segments, I think we'd love, Oxford, we'd love to chat to see how can we discuss with you and with YouTube how can we make those measurable? Because I think with the changes that are coming up right now, it is the time to discuss it and make sure when this is all rolled out, that measurement is not some afterthought. In that actually, if you're a creator, it is. We think measurement is possible and it's definitely doable. And now is a great time to discuss it and let your voice be heard.
You're alluding specifically to YouTube's effectively the DAI test,
right,
which I think for creators.
Which I think is coming out early next year. There's been some press releases about it earlier this year, but in early next year, I believe.
Yeah, I think a big opportunity for creators and advertisers to, prove the value of those investments. All right. Well, let's leave it there. We have had a great conversation. Thank you, Pete, so much for joining and for collaborating so openly on this, and sharing data and resources, thought leadership, etc. So thank you, and thank you to our loyal listeners and our new listeners for listening. Appreciate you joining us today, and I urge you all to visit our website. Go to oxfordroad.com and go to our thought leadership page. And on the oxfordroad.com thought leadership page, you will find the Rethinking YouTube white paper. And please go and download that white paper today. And you will see, all of the charts that Pete and I referred to, and some other ones, and, perhaps some more articulation of some of the points we've been discussing here. So oxfordroad.com, thought leadership, Rethinking YouTube. And with that said, this podcast is brought to you by Oxford Road, where we want you to succeed in audio and to use influence for good. As members of the marketing community, we have the power to advance voices that don't just entertain, but edify, to build bridges across differences and preserve fair-minded discussion across the most important topics of our age. If you're a marketer looking to align your brand values with extraordinary business outcomes, reach out to our agency, Oxford Road, by visiting oxfordroad.com and subscribing to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer, or contact us. We'd love to hear from you. If you have any feedback or suggestions about the show or anything else, you can also reach us at info@mediaroundtable.com. Thank you very much again to Pete and to the team at Podcast One, and Haley and Bianca and all the team at Oxford Road. As always, influence responsibly.